Rain poured down in torrents, each heavy drop pounding against the rickety awning, where Ethan, a scrawny 13-year-old boy, huddled in the shadows. The storm roared outside, thunder and lightning tearing through the sky as if trying to rip the night apart. Suddenly, amidst the howling wind, a raspy voice echoed from the nearby alley. "Ethan, is that you?" The boy jolted, his heart hammering in his chest. Who's there?" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking against the relentless rain. A staggering figure emerged under the faint glow of a street lamp. Henry, an old man with a blood-streaked face, collapsing to the ground. You're Ethan, right? I've been looking for you. For years," he whispered, clutching a metal box tightly before passing out. Ethan froze, his mind spinning. "How does he know my name?" he muttered, tears mixing with the rain. "Welcome, everyone, to this heart-pounding story," a warm, gripping voice chimed in. "Ethan and Henry have just crossed paths in this fateful storm. But why does Henry know the boy's name? What secret hides inside that box? Hit that like button if you're curious, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a comment. Who do you think Henry is? Stick with us to the end to find out. The storm wasn't just nature's fury, it was the chaos swirling in Ethan's heart. He shivered beneath the awning of an abandoned shop, his thin arms wrapped tightly around himself, clinging to the last scraps of warmth in his soaked, tattered shirt. His eyes, deep and weary, stared out at the blinding curtain of rain, where the street lamp flickered like it might give out any second. It had been 3 years since his mother, Emily, passed away, leaving him alone on the cold, unforgiving streets of the city. Memories of her were fading fragments now, a warm hand, a soft lullaby, and her final words before she closed her eyes. "Be strong, Ethan." But how could he be strong when hunger gnawed at his stomach, when every night was a fight to survive? Henry's cry snapped him out of his thoughts. Ethan shot to his feet, his bare, freezing toes sinking into the wet ground. Every instinct screamed at him, "Don't go near him, it's dangerous." Ethan wasn't naive. He'd seen bloody street fights, felt kicks from drunks when he tried to snatch a crumb of bread. But that voice, frail, desperate, and calling his name, pierced through the invisible armor he'd built around himself. It stirred echoes of his mother, the days she'd held him tight in the rain, whispering that he'd never be alone. Ethan bit his lip, his hands curling into fists. "I can't just leave him," he mumbled, his voice lost in the wind. He stepped out from the awning, rain slashing his face like icy blades. Through the downpour, he saw Henry sprawled on the ground, blood from a gash on his forehead, mingling with the rain in jagged red streaks. The old man's worn suit was torn at the shoulder, his trembling hands clutching the box like it was a treasure. Ethan dropped to his knees, his breath ragged. Are you alive?" he asked, his shaking hand brushing Henry's shoulder. The old man's eyes fluttered open, cloudy, but sparking with hope when they landed on Ethan. "Ethan," he rasped, his voice so faint it nearly drowned in the rain. "It's you, I knew it." Ethan recoiled, panic surging. "How do you know me? Who are you?" he yelled. But Henry didn't answer. His eyes slipped shut, his grip loosening, revealing the scratched, sleek metal box. Ethan's trembling hands picked it up, the cold biting into his skin. He pried it open, and in the dim glow of the street lamp he saw an old photo, a young woman cradling a newborn next to a crumpled note that read, "Ethan, you are my light." He staggered, as if struck by lightning. The woman in the photo, it was his mother, Emily. "Mom," he whispered, tears welling up despite his efforts to hold them back. But before he could process it, another sound cut through. Heavy footsteps echoing from the end of the alley. Ethan's head snapped up, his blood turning to ice. 2 dark figures loomed in the rain, their eyes scanning the shadows like wolves on the hunt. "Where's that old bastard?" one growled, his voice low and chilling. "Find him. Get the box back." Ethan clutched the box to his chest, his body shaking uncontrollably. He didn't know what it held or why it mattered, but Henry's eyes, even unconscious, seemed to beg him not to let go. There was no time to hesitate. Gritting his teeth, Ethan dragged Henry into a hidden corner behind a pile of rotting trash cans. The stench hit him hard, but he didn't care. He piled broken wood over the old man, shielding him from view. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, his voice trembling. Henry didn't respond, but his hand tightened faintly. A fragile thank you. The footsteps grew louder. One of the men kicked a trash can a few meters away, the clang piercing the air. Ethan crouched low, holding his breath, his eyes locked on the two figures prowling the alley. "He's got to be here somewhere," the other muttered, suspicious. Cold sweat trickled down Ethan's spine despite the soaking rain. He glanced at the box, his shaking fingers brushing the photo. If this was his mom, then who was Henry, and why had he come for him? Henry let out a faint groan, and Ethan clamped a hand over his mouth, hissing, "Shh, they'll hear you." The old man's eyes cracked open, filled with fear, but he nodded, struggling to stay silent. The men stopped just steps away. One bent down, snatching a torn scrap of Henry's suit jacket, smirking. "He's close. Keep looking." Ethan's throat went dry, his heart pounding so loud he feared they'd hear it. He scanned the ground, desperate for a distraction. A small stone lay at his feet, not big but heavy enough. He grabbed it, took a deep breath, and hurled it toward the far end of the alley. It struck the wall with a sharp clack, ringing out. The men whipped around, charging toward the sound, shouting, "Over there!" Ethan didn't dare breathe. He waited, each second stretching into eternity, until their footsteps faded into the storm. He turned to Henry, whispering, "Are you okay? I'll get you out of here." But the old man only shook his head weakly, his breaths shallow and quick. Panic gripped Ethan as he pressed a hand to Henry's chest, feeling a faint, faltering heartbeat. "Don't die," he muttered, tears blending with the rain. Red flashing lights sliced through the downpour, an ambulance's glow illuminating the dark alley. Ethan leapt up, waving frantically. "Here, hurry," he shouted. The siren wailed closer, carrying a sliver of hope. But as he looked down at Henry, a burning question blazed in his mind. "Who are you, and why is my mother in that box?" The rain kept falling relentlessly, each icy drop stinging Ethan's face like invisible needles. The dark alley now felt like a trap, its stained walls closing in as the wind howled through like the growl of a wild beast. Ethan knelt beside Henry, the old man he'd dragged into the shadowy corner behind a pile of rusted trash cans. Henry's breaths were shallow, broken, his eyes shut tight as if sinking into a dream. Blood trickled from the gash on his forehead, mixing with the rain to form dark red streaks on the ground. Ethan gripped the metal box tightly, his trembling fingers tracing the scratches on its cold surface. The words, "Find Ethan," scrawled on the crumpled note inside, echoed in his mind, a riddle without an answer. But there was no time to think. Heavy footsteps thudded again from the alley's entrance, slow and menacing. The two dark figures had returned. The men in black Ethan had glimpsed when they'd run off earlier. A gravelly voice sliced through the rain. "That old man couldn't have gone far. Search harder. If we don't get that thing back, the boss won't let it slide." Ethan's heart pounded like it might burst from his chest. He crouched lower, pressing himself against the trash cans, trying to shield both himself and Henry from the razor-sharp gaze of their hunters. He glanced at Henry, whispering, "You've got to hold on. I'll figure something out." But Henry only let out a faint groan, his trembling hand brushing Ethan's arm. "The box. Don't let them take it," he murmured, his voice so weak it nearly vanished in the rain. Ethan nodded, though he didn't understand why this box mattered so much. It was just a small thing, but the desperation in Henry's eyes made it feel like it held an entire world of secrets he couldn't yet grasp. The footsteps drew closer. One of the men kicked a trash can a few meters away, the metal clanging sharply in the cramped space. Ethan held his breath, clutching the box so tightly his knuckles turned white. He knew if they found him, he wouldn't stand a chance at escape. Years on the streets had taught him that men like these didn't know mercy, only violence and cruelty. But he couldn't abandon Henry. Though he'd known the old man for less than 10 minutes, Ethan felt an invisible thread tying them together, a pull he couldn't explain. "Something's over here," one of the men said, his voice laced with suspicion. He stepped forward, his polished leather shoes splashing rhythmically in the puddles. Peering through a gap between the trash cans, Ethan saw the towering figure approaching. The beam of a flashlight in the man's hand swept across the wall, landing just steps from their hiding spot. Ethan felt cold sweat trickle down his spine, despite the soaking rain. He ducked his head, praying the darkness would shield them. Then Henry groaned, a small, feeble sound, but enough to make the man freeze. "Did you hear that?" He snapped to his partner, his tone tight with tension. Ethan pressed his hand over Henry's mouth, whispering, "No, you have to stay quiet." Henry's eyes widened, brimming with fear, but he gave a faint nod, struggling to stifle his pain. The man took another step, his flashlight beam cutting straight toward the trash cans. The light grazed past, missing Ethan's head by inches. His breath caught, the air in his lungs feeling like it had been sucked dry. "Probably just a rat," the other man scoffed dismissively. "Hurry up, I'm not standing in this rain all night." The one with the flashlight hesitated, then turned away, the beam swinging off their hiding spot. Ethan exhaled silently, relief washing over him for a fleeting moment. But it shattered when Henry coughed, a short, sharp sound that pierced the steady rain. The men spun back around, their eyes locking onto the shadowed corner where Ethan and Henry hid. "Over there!" one shouted, charging forward. Panic flooded Ethan, his mind racing for a way out. He couldn't fight them, he was just a skinny, weak kid with no weapons or strength. But he couldn't let Henry fall into their hands either. In a split second, he spotted a jagged piece of broken glass lying near the trash pile. Without a second thought, he grabbed it, gripping it tight even as its sharp edges sliced into his skin, blood welling up. "Run," Henry whispered, his eyes wide as he stared at Ethan. "Save the box." But Ethan shook his head, his voice trembling. "I'm not leaving you." He stood, facing the two men barreling toward him. The closer one reached out to grab him, but Ethan swung the glass shard forward, yelling, "Stay back!" The man flinched, stumbling back, but his partner surged forward, a gleaming dagger flashing in his hand. "Hand over the box, kid," the man with the knife growled, his voice ice-cold. "Or you and the old man die right here." Ethan stepped back, clutching the box to his chest. Blood dripped from his hand onto the ground, mingling with the rain. But fear had given way to something fiercer, determination he didn't know he had. "No," he shouted, his voice breaking. "You're not touching him." The man with the knife sneered, closing in. But just then another sound broke through, the distant but unmistakable wail of an ambulance siren cutting through the thick rain. Ethan whipped his head around, catching the faint flicker of red lights at the street's end. Hope flared in his chest like a tiny flame in the storm. The man with the knife heard it too, his gaze flickering between Ethan and the approaching lights. "Damn it," he muttered, turning to his partner. "Let's go. We're out of time." But the knife wielder wasn't ready to give up. He lunged, the blade aimed straight at Ethan. The boy dodged, crashing to the ground as the box slipped from his hands and rolled away. The man bent to grab it, but Ethan scrambled up, throwing himself at the man's legs. "You can't have it," he screamed, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the rain. The man yanked his leg free, kicking Ethan hard in the stomach. Pain exploded through him as he collapsed, clutching his gut. But the kick threw the man off balance, and the ambulance lights now flooded the alley. "Move!" the other man yelled, dragging his partner away. The two figures vanished into the rain, leaving Ethan sprawled on the ground, gasping for air. He crawled to the box, scooping it up and hugging it close, then turned back to Henry. The old man lay still, his eyes half open, watching Ethan with a faint, grateful glimmer. "You're so brave, kid," Henry whispered, his trembling hand brushing Ethan's. The ambulance siren was deafening now, right on top of them. Ethan staggered to his feet, waving desperately. "Here, help him," he shouted. Paramedics rushed over, their flashlights illuminating Henry's pale face. One knelt to check him, while another helped Ethan up. "You okay, kid?" the medic asked, voice thick with concern. Ethan nodded, though his body ached and his hand still bled. He didn't care about himself. His eyes were fixed on Henry, now being lifted onto a stretcher. As the team loaded Henry into the ambulance, the old man suddenly grabbed Ethan's hand, whispering, "Don't lose that box. It's everything." Ethan nodded, still unsure what it all meant. He climbed into the ambulance beside Henry, clutching the box tightly. As the doors slammed shut, he peered out the window, the rain blurring into a haze, but the questions in his mind sharpened. What is this box? And why was he willing to die for it? The ambulance siren wailed piercingly, cutting through the thick rain like a fragile promise amidst the storm. Flashing red lights bathed the dark alley where Ethan had just endured the most terrifying moments of his life. He stood there, rain streaming down his pale face, trembling hands clutching the metal box. The one Henry, the old man now lying on a stretcher, had entrusted to him with desperate urgency. The paramedics swiftly lifted Henry into the vehicle, their movements sharp, but unable to mask the worry etched on their faces. Ethan followed, his bare feet caked with mud and trembling from cold and exhaustion, yet his gaze never strayed from Henry. "Hurry up, kid," a paramedic shouted, pulling Ethan inside. The doors slammed shut, silencing the rain and wind outside, leaving only the cramped space filled with the sharp scent of antiseptic and Henry's labored breathing. Ethan sank onto the bench beside the old man, still gripping the box, his palms slick with rain and blood from the gash left by the broken glass. One paramedic knelt by Henry, inspecting the wound on his forehead, while another attached an oxygen mask. "He's in bad shape," the gloved man muttered, tension lacing his voice. "Lost a lot of blood. Could be a concussion." Ethan stared at Henry, his heart clenching. The old man lay there, eyes closed, his face ghostly pale under the harsh white lights of the ambulance. His tattered suit was soaked through, but his trembling hands still seemed to cling to life. "Will he be okay?" Ethan whispered, his voice faltering. The paramedic glanced at him, a flicker of pity in his eyes. "We're doing everything we can. You did great calling us in time." But Ethan didn't feel like he'd done anything extraordinary. He'd acted on instinct, driven by a pull deep inside, a feeling he couldn't name. He bowed his head, staring at the box in his hands. The words "Find Ethan" scrawled on the note inside haunted him, a question dangling in the air. Why was his name there? Who was Henry, and why was he being hunted? He wanted to ask, to understand, but seeing Henry's faint breaths, Ethan stayed silent, gripping the old man's hand as a quiet vow not to abandon him. The ambulance jolted over the flooded streets, its siren mingling with distant thunder. Inside, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the steady beep of machines and Henry's ragged gasps. Ethan sat there, time stretching endlessly. He replayed the alley in his mind, the glint of the knife, the kick to his stomach, Henry's pleading eyes as he begged him to protect the box. He didn't know why he'd risked everything, but deep down, Ethan knew that abandoning Henry would have left a guilt he could never forgive. Suddenly, Henry's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy, but a faint spark within them startled Ethan. "Kid," he rasped, his voice rough like wind over dry sand. Ethan leaned closer, ear straining to catch the words. "Don't lose it," Henry said, his shaking hand brushing the box in Ethan's grip. "It's everything." Ethan nodded, though the true meaning eluded him. "I'll keep it safe, don't worry," he whispered, voice trembling. "You've got to live, okay?" Henry managed a weak smile, pale but genuine. You're like her," he murmured, his gaze drifting as if lost in a distant memory. Ethan frowned, his heart racing. "Like who?" he asked, but Henry didn't respond. His eyes slipped shut again, his breathing growing heavier. Panic surged through Ethan as he squeezed Henry's hand, shouting, "Don't sleep, tell me." A paramedic rested a hand on his shoulder, shaking his head. "Let him rest, kid. He needs strength." Ethan sank back, helplessness flooding him. He looked at Henry, then the box, his mind spinning with unanswered questions. "You're like her," the words echoed, conjuring his mother's image from her final days. But how could Henry know? They'd only just met. Or was there something deeper Ethan hadn't grasped? He wanted to open the box, to search for clues, but the paramedic's stern look held him back. The ambulance lurched violently, snapping Ethan from his thoughts. A loud bang rang out, and the vehicle tilted to one side. "What's happening?" Ethan yelled, gripping the bench to steady himself. The paramedic up front spun around, voice taut. "Someone's blocking the road. On purpose." Ethan peered through the window, spotting a sleek black car cutting through the rain, its blinding headlights aimed at the ambulance. His heart seized. They were back, the men from the alley. They hadn't given up. "Speed up, go!" The paramedic barked at the driver. The ambulance roared forward, but the black car didn't relent, swerving close, tires screeching on the wet pavement. Ethan clutched the box tighter, his body shaking with fear. "They want this," he shouted, holding it up for the paramedic to see. The man frowned but had no time to question. "Hold on to it, kid. We'll get him to the hospital safe." The ambulance veered through a sharp turn, water splashing against the windows. The black car stayed on their tail, but the driver slammed the brakes, then gunned the engine, throwing the pursuers off balance. The black car skidded, crashing into a roadside pole with a deafening crunch. Ethan exhaled as it vanished into the rain. "They're gone," the driver muttered, still tense, "but I don't like this one bit." Ethan turned back to Henry. The old man remained unconscious, but his hand now gripped Ethan's as if sensing the danger they'd escaped. Ethan leaned down, whispering, "I won't let them take you or this box, I promise." He didn't know where the courage came from, but in that moment, Ethan felt he was no longer just a nameless street kid. He was the only one Henry could rely on. The ambulance screeched to a halt at the hospital entrance. The doors flew open, and the team rushed Henry inside. Ethan followed, his legs numb from cold, but his eyes fixed on the old man. As they hurried through the hospital's stark white halls, a paramedic glanced back. "Want to stay with him, kid?" Ethan nodded without hesitation. "I have to," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. But as they reached the ER, Henry's eyes flickered open again. He looked at Ethan, his cloudy gaze sparking with faint resolve. You're not a stranger," he whispered, so soft it was nearly lost. "I've been looking for you for so long." Ethan froze, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" he asked. But Henry didn't answer. His eyes closed, his hand fell limp, and the medical team whisked him into surgery. Ethan stood alone in the cold hallway, still clutching the box. Henry's words rang in his ears. "I've been looking for you for so long." He didn't understand, but a strange feeling swelled inside, a connection he couldn't name. He glanced at the box, trembling fingers brushing its lid. Maybe it was time to open it, to find answers. But before he could, a nurse approached, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You need to rest," she said. "He'll be okay." Ethan nodded, but deep down he knew this was only the beginning. The storm outside might have passed, But the one in his life, and Henry's, was still brewing ahead. The cold white glow of fluorescent lights flooded the hospital hallway, a stark contrast to the pitch-black night and roaring storm outside. The hurried footsteps of nurses, the steady hum of machines, and the sharp tang of antiseptic blended into a chaotic symphony. Ethan stood in the corridor, his bare, mud-streaked feet trembling on the icy tiles, clutching the metal box like it was the only thing anchoring him. Henry, the old man he'd risked everything to save, had been whisked into the emergency room. The double doors slammed shut in front of him, leaving Ethan in a breathless silence, weighed down by a flood of unanswered questions. He leaned against the wall, exhaustion crashing over him. His hands still shook, not just from the cold, but from the whirlwind of the alley and the ambulance chase. The men in black, the glinting knife, the kick to his stomach, Henry's desperate gaze, all of it felt like a nightmare he couldn't shake. But what kept his heart racing was Henry's final words before he slipped away. "I've been looking for you for so long." They echoed in Ethan's mind, a stray puzzle piece in the fragmented picture of his life. A picture he'd never thought he had the right to paint. A nurse approached, her face soft but etched with concern. "You should sit and rest," she said, gesturing to a row of grey plastic chairs at the hall's end. "He's being taken care of, don't worry." Ethan nodded, but he couldn't stay still. He followed her, eyes locked on the ER doors. "Can I stay with him?" he asked, his voice hoarse with fatigue. She offered a small smile and nodded. "Sure, but let's get that hand bandaged first. You're still bleeding." Ethan glanced down, only now noticing the cut from the broken glass, still oozing blood, staining his tattered shirt red. He nodded, letting her lead him to a corner where she quickly wrapped the wound. But his mind was elsewhere, on Henry, the box, and those strange words. When the nurse left, Ethan sank into a chair, resting the box on his lap. He wanted to open it, to uncover its secrets, but an unshakable fear held him back. What if the truth inside was more than he could bear? The ER doors swung open abruptly, yanking him from his thoughts. A doctor emerged, sweat glistening on his brow, his eyes tense yet tinged with relief. "You're the one who came with him?" he asked, looking at Ethan. The boy nodded, springing to his feet. "How is he?" His voice quivered with a mix of hope and dread. The doctor sighed, wiping his hands on his white coat. "He lost a lot of blood, but we've stabilized him. The head wound isn't too severe, but he's weak. He's awake now, and he wants to see you." A warmth surged in Ethan's chest, chasing away the chill clinging to him. "Can I go in?" he asked, his tone urgent. The doctor nodded, leading him through the doors. Inside, the light was softer, but the air hung heavy with the buzz of machines and the scent of medicine. Henry lay on the bed, an IV line in his arm, his face pale but his eyes open. When he saw Ethan, a faint smile curved his lips, and his trembling hand beckoned the boy closer. Ethan sat by the bedside, his voice catching. "Are you okay?" Henry nodded slowly, a spark of life flickering in his gaze. "Thanks to you," he rasped, his voice rough. "You saved me." Ethan shook his head, looking down. "I just did what I had to. If I hadn't called the ambulance, you—" He trailed off, but Henry understood. The old man reached out, his frail grip warm on Ethan's hand. "Not just that," Henry said, his voice trembling. "You kept the box. You fought for it." Ethan's eyes fell to the box, his heart pounding harder. "What is it?" he asked, unable to hold back his curiosity. "Why do they want it? And why do you know my name?" Henry went quiet, his gaze drifting as if sifting through buried memories. Then he exhaled, a heavy breath laced with pain and regret. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice breaking, "you're not a stranger to me. I've been searching for you for so long, ever since I lost everything." Ethan froze, his body rigid as if turned to ice. What are you saying?" he stammered, his mind reeling. Henry took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with tears. "I'm your grandfather, Ethan," he said, his voice shaky but resolute. "Your mother, Emily, was my daughter. I lost her, and I thought I'd lost you too." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He shook his head, disbelief crashing over him. "No, that's impossible. Mum never mentioned you. She said it was just the two of us." Henry closed his eyes, a tear tracing down his wrinkled cheek. "Emily left me when she was young," he murmured. "I used to be wealthy, but I got tangled in bad things, a debt to dangerous people. She didn't want me dragging her into it, so she left, taking you with her while you were still in her womb. I searched for her for years, but by the time I found out where she was, it was too late. She was gone, and you'd vanished." Ethan's throat tightened, tears welling up despite his efforts to hold them back. "Then why now?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Henry opened his eyes, meeting Ethan's with unspoken anguish. "I tried, Ethan. When I learned she was gone, I hired detectives to find you. But you were on the streets, no trace, no one knew who you were. This was my only lead." He pointed to the box in Ethan's hands. "Emily left it for me before she died. Inside is her letter and a message, 'Find Ethan.' I've carried it all these years, hoping I'd find you one day." Trembling, Ethan opened the box, no longer hesitating. Beyond the photo he'd seen, his mother cradling a newborn, was a folded letter. He unfolded it, his mother's handwritten words blurring but clear. "Dad, if you find this, find Ethan. Don't let him live like I did, running and afraid. But if you're still tied to those people, leave him be. He deserves freedom." At the bottom, a final line. "Ethan, if you read this, forgive me. I love you." Ethan broke down, tears splashing onto the letter, smudging the ink. "Mum?" he whispered, his voice shattering. Henry reached out, clasping his hand, tears streaming down his own face. "I'm sorry, Ethan," he said. "I hurt Emily, and I couldn't protect you sooner. But now I've found you, and I won't lose you again." But their tender moment shattered with a loud crash. The ER doors burst open, and two figures in white coats stepped in, their eyes cold, nothing like doctors. Ethan recognized them instantly, the men in black, now disguised as staff. One drew a knife from beneath his coat, his voice low and icy. "Hand over the box, old man. No escape this time." Ethan leapt up, clutching the box, shouting, "No, you're not touching him." Henry struggled to sit, but he was too weak. "Ethan, run!" he cried, his voice desperate, but Ethan didn't budge. He stood in front of the bed, hands shaking but eyes resolute. "I'm not leaving you," he said, his voice choking. The man with the knife smirked, stepping closer, but just then the hospital alarm blared. A team of security guards stormed in, subduing the intruders before they could act. Ethan collapsed to the floor, breathless, tears still falling. Henry gripped his hand, whispering, "You're my grandson, brave like Emily." Ethan smiled through his tears, feeling for the first time that he wasn't alone. But he knew the fight wasn't over. The box was still the key, and their enemies wouldn't stop. The hospital, meant to be a sanctuary amidst the storm, had morphed into a stifling battlefield. The flickering white light from the fluorescent bulbs cast eerie reflections on the glossy tiles, painting cold streaks across the floor. Ethan stood before Henry's bed, his small hands trembling as they clutched the metal box, the one his grandfather had entrusted to him with his last shred of hope. The alarm blared through the corridors, but in this cramped emergency room, time seemed to freeze. Two men in black, disguised in stolen white coats, loomed before him, their eyes glinting with a chilling menace as sharp as the blade one of them had just unsheathed. "Hand over the box, kid," the knife wielder growled, his voice low and cutting like ice. The dagger in his hand flashed under the lights, a beacon of unavoidable danger. Ethan stumbled back a step, his spine pressing against the edge of Henry's bed. He glanced at his grandfather, who struggled to sit up despite his frail, faltering body. "Ethan, run!" Henry shouted, his voice cracking with pain and desperation. But Ethan shook his head, his tear-streaked eyes blazing with a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. "No, I won't leave you," he choked out, tears streaming down his cheeks. The other man sneered, stepping closer. "You want to die with the old man? Don't be stupid, kid. Give us the box, and I'll let you live." He reached out as if Ethan were easy prey to be subdued. But Ethan didn't budge. He hugged the box to his chest, feeling the wild thudding of his heart. His mother's letter, Emily's words, echoed in his mind. "Ethan, you deserve freedom." He didn't fully grasp what it meant, but he knew that surrendering the box would render Henry's sacrifices meaningless. "I'll count to 3, the knife wielder said, his tone frigid. 1. Ethan's eyes darted around, searching for anything to defend himself. On the table beside the bed, a pair of medical scissors glinted under the light. He took a deep breath, steadying himself despite the fear coursing through him. 2. The man advanced, raising the knife. Ethan didn't wait for 3. He lunged, snatched the scissors, and swung them at the man, yelling, "Stay away from him!" The thug flinched, staggering back, but his partner reacted swiftly. He grabbed Ethan's collar, yanking him hard and sending him crashing to the floor. The box slipped from his grasp, rolling away with a sharp clang as it hit the tiles. Ethan cried out, scrambling to retrieve it, but the knife wielder was faster. He scooped up the box, a triumphant smirk curling his lips. "Finally got it," he said, his voice dripping with glee. "You and the old man are done." But Henry wouldn't let it end there. With the last of his strength, he staggered to his feet, dragging the IV line still tethered to his arm. "Let him go," he roared, his raspy voice carrying a surprising force. The knife wielder spun around, his eyes darkening. "Want to die early, old man?" He charged, aiming the blade at Henry's chest. Ethan screamed, "No!" and threw himself between them, shoving Henry back onto the bed, just as the knife grazed his shoulder. Hot blood spilled, soaking his shirt, but Ethan barely registered the pain. He whirled, gripping the scissors, and plunged them into the man's hand. The thug howled, dropping the knife and clutching his wound. The second man lunged, reaching for the box, but a thunder of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Hospital security burst in, batons raised. "Drop your weapons," one barked. The intruders froze, exchanging panicked glances before bolting for the window, intent on smashing through. But the guards were quicker. A baton struck the knife wielder's back, sending him crumpling, while the other was pinned and cuffed in an instant. The box hit the floor again, rolling to Ethan's feet. He knelt, picking it up and clutching it close. Blood dripped from his shoulder onto the tiles, but he felt no pain. He turned to Henry, who lay panting on the bed. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Henry nodded faintly, his hand grasping Ethan's. "You saved me again," he whispered, tears tracing down his weathered face. "I don't deserve it, Ethan." Ethan shook his head, tears falling freely. "You're my grandfather," he said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't let you die. Never." Henry smiled, a pained, joyful curve of his lips. "You're so much like Emily. Brave, stubborn, and never giving up." He squeezed Ethan's hand as if pouring his remaining strength into him. "But the box. You need to know the truth." Ethan opened it again, his breath hitching. Beyond the photo and his mother's letter, he found something else, a small USB drive taped beneath the lining. He frowned, looking at Henry. "What's this?" Henry sighed, his eyes clouding with painful memories. "Evidence," he said. "Proof of what I did, and what I owe those people. Years ago, I worked for a gang. Not by choice, but because I had none left. They forced me to launder money, and I stole their data to protect Emily. When she left, I kept it, hoping one day I'd use it to make amends. Ethan stared, his hand trembling around the USB. So they've been hunting you for this? Henry nodded, his voice dropping low. Yes. It holds transaction records, names of their leaders, enough to dismantle the whole operation. I planned to give it to the police, but they found out first. I've been running ever since, and tonight, they almost killed me. Ethan looked from the USB to Henry, his mind spinning. Why didn't you turn it in sooner? Why hold on to it? Henry closed his eyes, a tear slipping free. I was scared, Ethan, scared that if I did, they'd track you down. My grandson, the last piece of me left in this world. I wanted to shield you, even when I didn't know where you were. But now you're here and I can't run anymore. Ethan bowed his head, tears splashing onto the box. He didn't know what to feel, anger that Henry had left his mother to live in fear, or gratitude for the sacrifices he'd made to find him. But before he could speak, a loud noise erupted from the hallway. The door flew open and a squad of police stormed in, guns drawn. Henry Carter, one called, his gaze piercing. We got a report of an attack. You've got some explaining to do. Henry looked at Ethan, offering a faint smile. Give it to them, Ethan, he said. It's time to end this. Ethan hesitated, then stepped forward, handing the USB to the officer. This is what they wanted, he said, his voice shaky. It'll help you catch them. The officer raised a brow, glancing at Henry, then nodded. We'll check it out. If it's what you say, you'll be under protection. As the police left, Ethan returned to Henry's side. The old man clasped his hand, whispering, Thank you, Ethan. You've given me a chance to start over and make things right with Emily. Ethan sat, gripping Henry's hand, tears streaming down. Thank you too, he said, for finding me and giving me a family. But deep down, Ethan knew it wasn't truly over. The two men in black were caught, but the boss they'd mentioned still lurked out there. He looked at the empty box in his hands, sensing a new storm brewing. This time, though, he wasn't alone. The first light of dawn slipped through the hospital windows, chasing away the shadows of a long, turbulent night. The rain had stopped, leaving a gentle stillness to blanket the cold hallway. Ethan sat by Henry's bedside, his hands still gripping his grandfather's, as if letting go might make everything dissolve like a dream. Henry lay there, his breathing steadier after emergency surgery to treat the wound on his head. The metal box, now empty, rested quietly on the bedside table. The USB inside had been handed to the police, carrying the dark secrets of Henry's past and the promise of a new future. Ethan bowed his head, his eyes red from tears and sleeplessness. The past few hours had been an emotional whirlwind, from the terror of facing the two men in black in the ER to the shock of learning Henry was his grandfather and finally the relief of escaping death's grasp. He glanced at the bandaged wound on his shoulder, a makeshift fix, but the pain felt trivial now. All that mattered was Henry, the man he'd once thought a stranger, now the only family he had left in the world. The door creaked open, and a middle-aged man stepped in, dressed in a sharp black suit, his expression stern yet composed. I'm James Carter, Henry's lawyer, he introduced himself. Ethan looked up, nodding faintly, unaccustomed to facing someone like James. You're Ethan, right? James asked, his tone softening as he took in the scrawny, battered boy before him. Henry told me about you. You're incredibly brave. Ethan shrugged, unsure how to respond. I just did what I could, he whispered, his voice hoarse. James offered a small smile, pulling a chair to sit beside Henry, who had just stirred from his sedation. James, Henry murmured, his eyes lighting up at the sight of his old friend. Thank you for coming, James nodded, setting his briefcase on the table. I heard from the police. They caught the two who attacked you, and that USB the kid gave them. It's gold. The transactions and names on it are enough to take down a major syndicate. Henry exhaled, a breath both relieved and burdened. "So I can make amends," he said, his voice trembling. "But I need one more thing, James. I want Ethan to stay with me, legally." Ethan jolted, staring at Henry. "What do you mean?" he asked, his heart racing. Henry turned to him, a weak smile breaking through. "I lost your mother, Ethan. I can't lose you too. I want to claim you as my grandson, officially, so you never have to go back to the streets." Ethan's throat tightened. He'd never imagined a home, a family, luxuries that seemed like distant dreams for a street kid. "But I don't know anything about living like that," he whispered, his voice faltering. "All I know is running and surviving." Henry gripped his hand tighter, his eyes blazing with determination. "I'll teach you, Ethan. We'll learn how to live again, together." James nodded, opening his briefcase. "I've started the paperwork for temporary guardianship," he said. "But it won't be easy. Ethan's a homeless minor under social services jurisdiction. We need to prove Henry's fit to care for you, especially after last night." Ethan frowned, a new worry bubbling up. "What if they don't agree?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Where will they take me?" Henry squeezed his hand, his tone firm. "I won't let that happen, Ethan. Whatever it takes, I'll keep you with me." James chimed in. "We'll fight for it. The USB doesn't just dismantle the gang, it proves Henry's cooperation with the police. That'll lighten his legal burden and strengthen our case." But before they could continue, a knock sounded. A woman entered, dressed in a grey suit, her face serious yet kind. "I'm Linda Harris, from Social Services," she introduced herself, glancing from Henry to Ethan. "I'm here to assess the situation after last night's incident." Ethan's heart clenched. He'd heard of social services, people who could send him to an orphanage or foster home, places he dreaded. He clung to Henry's hand tighter, silently pleading not to be taken away. Linda sat, her voice gentle but professional. "Ethan, I know you've been through a lot. I'm not here to make things harder, but to ensure— Whoops, I meant oops, not whoops." Ethan's heart sank. He'd heard of social services, people who could send him to an orphanage or foster home, places he dreaded. He clung to Henry's hand tighter, silently pleading not to be taken away. Linda sat, her voice gentle but professional. "Ethan, I know you've been through a lot. I'm not here to make things harder, but to ensure you're safe." Ethan looked at her, his voice trembling. "I'm safe with my grandfather. I don't want to go anywhere else." Linda smiled faintly, jotting something in her notebook. "I understand, but we need to look deeper. Henry just survived an attack, and his health isn't stable yet. We need time." Henry sat up, wincing but resolute. "I'm not too weak to care for my grandson," he said firmly. "I lost my daughter to my mistakes. I won't lose Ethan." Linda met his gaze, her expression softening. "I don't doubt your love, Mr. Henry, but this is a legal matter. I'll file my report, and we'll have a court hearing to decide." Ethan felt a chill race down his spine. "A hearing?" he asked, panic creeping in. James rested a hand on his shoulder, reassuring him. "Don't worry, Ethan. Henry and I will do everything to keep you here. You saved him. Your story will sway anyone." Linda nodded, standing. "I'll do my best to support you. Ethan, you're strong. I believe you'll get through this." As Linda left, Ethan turned to Henry, tears streaming down his face. "I'm scared," he whispered. "If they take me, I'll be alone again." Henry pulled him into a shaky embrace. "You're never alone anymore, Ethan," he said, his voice thick. "No matter what, I'll find a way to bring you back." "I promise." Ethan nodded, hugging his grandfather tightly, feeling the warmth of a man he'd once thought a stranger. The next day, the police returned with news. "We nabbed the gang's leader thanks to that USB data," an officer said, excitement in his tone. "Henry, your cooperation clears you of charges, but you and the boy need protection until things settle." Ethan exhaled, relieved, though he knew the legal battle loomed ahead. James and Henry began preparing for the court hearing, while Ethan underwent a health check at Linda's request. That night, as moonlight spilled through the window, Ethan sat by Henry, recounting his street days, the hunger, the cold, the times he nearly gave up. Henry listened, tears tracing his weathered face. "I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner," he said, "but from now on, I'll make up for it." Ethan smiled, a real glimmer of hope sparking after years. "I want to make up for you, too," he said. "We're family, right?" Henry nodded, pulling him close. "Yes, Ethan, and no one can tear us apart." As dawn broke again, Ethan stood by the window, gazing at the clear sky post-storm. He held Henry's hand, whispering, "I promise I won't leave you, no matter what." Henry smiled, his eyes gleaming like the morning sun. "And I promise you a home, Ethan, a real one." The faint morning light filtered through the tall courtroom windows, casting a soft glow over the solemn, frigid space. Polished wooden benches stood in neat rows, the hushed murmurs of attendees forming a tense undercurrent. Ethan sat on the defendant's bench, his small hands clasped tightly, palms slick with sweat. The new clothes James, Henry's lawyer, had provided, a crisp white shirt and black trousers, felt alien against his skin, so used to the tattered rags of the streets. Beside him, Henry sat in a wheelchair, his face pale but his gaze unwavering, his hand gripping Ethan's in a silent reassurance. Today was the day that would decide everything. After relentless preparation, the hearing to determine Henry's guardianship over Ethan had finally arrived. James stood at the counsel table, briefcase open, his voice ringing out confidently as he argued their case. But Ethan couldn't focus on the words. His heart hammered, threatening to burst from his chest. He scanned the room, spotting Linda Harris from Social Services, seated across the aisle, her eyes kind yet resolute. He knew she wasn't the enemy, but the thought of being torn from Henry filled him with dread. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern face and silver-rimmed glasses, banged his gavel, calling for silence. "We're here to consider Henry Carter's temporary guardianship of the minor, Ethan," he said, his voice deep and clear. "I've reviewed the reports from Social Services and police records, but I want to hear from those involved. Mr. Carter, what do you have to say?" Henry drew a shaky breath, his voice rough but resolute. "Your Honor," he began, "I lost my daughter to mistakes I made long ago. I worked for a gang, dragged into a dark world I couldn't escape. When Emily, my daughter, left with Ethan in her womb, I lost everything. I searched for him for years, and when I found him in that alley that night, I knew it was my last chance to make things right. Ethan saved me, not once but twice, from killers' hands. I can't let him go back to the streets. I beg to care for him, whatever it takes." Ethan bowed his head, tears slipping silently onto his hands. Hearing Henry recount their story, he felt the weight of pain and regret in every word. The judge nodded, scribbling notes, then turned to Linda. "Ms. Harris, what's Social Services' stance?" Linda rose, her tone calm. "Your Honor, we acknowledge Ethan's bravery and Mr. Carter's intent. But he's just survived an attack, his health is fragile, and his past carries legal baggage. We're concerned he can't provide a stable, safe environment for Ethan long-term." Ethan's heart clenched. He wanted to scream that Henry was all he had, but James signaled him to stay quiet. The judge's gaze softened as it landed on Ethan. "Ethan, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me your story." Ethan swallowed hard, standing on shaky legs. He glanced at Henry, saw his grandfather's encouraging smile, and summoned every ounce of courage to speak. "Your Honor," he started, voice trembling, "I've lived on the street since I was little. My mum, Emily, died when I was 7, and I had no one. I slept in dark corners, ate scraps people threw away, and learned to run to survive. I never thought anyone would care about me. Until that night, I heard Henry calling for help in the alley. I was scared, but I couldn't leave him. I dragged him to safety from 2 men trying to kill him, and I called the ambulance, not even sure I was doing it right. Then he told me he was my grandfather, and I couldn't believe it. Tears streamed down Ethan's face, but he pressed on. He gave me a reason to live, sir. He protected me when those men came to the hospital, and I protected him too. I don't want money or anything big. I just want to stay with my grandfather because he's the first family I've had in years. He turned to Henry, voice breaking. I don't want to lose him. The courtroom fell silent, Ethan's soft sobs the only sound. Henry wiped his eyes, pride and pain shining in his gaze. The judge scribbled more notes, then looked to James. What's Mr. Carter's plan for the boy if granted guardianship? James stood, voice firm. Your Honor, Mr. Carter will provide Ethan a home, enroll him in school, and ensure full medical care. He's cooperated with police to dismantle the gang and has been cleared of charges. We've also set up a financial fund from his savings to support Ethan. The judge nodded, but before he could respond, the courtroom doors swung open. A uniformed officer rushed in, his face taut. Your Honor, he said urgently, I have critical information. Ethan and Henry exchanged a glance, Ethan's heart pounding. The officer approached, handing the judge a file. We've uncovered a revenge plot by the gang's remnants. They're targeting Mr. Carter and the boy over the USB data. If Ethan's separated and unprotected, he's in danger. The room buzzed with murmurs. Ethan gripped Henry's hand, fear surging anew. James leapt up. Your Honor, this proves Ethan must stay with Mr. Carter under police protection. Separating him now puts him at risk. Linda rose too, her voice anxious. I agree. If the threat persists, we can't guarantee Ethan's safety elsewhere. The judge sat quietly, reviewing the file. Then he banged his gavel, his voice decisive. This is an extraordinary case. I see the bond between Mr. Carter and Ethan and the clear risks of separation. I grant temporary guardianship to Mr. Carter on the condition he cooperates with police to ensure their safety. Social services will monitor for the next 6 months for further evaluation. Ethan exhaled, tears splashing onto the floor as he hugged Henry tightly. We did it, he whispered, voice breaking with relief. Henry embraced him, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, Ethan, he said. You've given me a family again. James and Linda smiled, their eyes reflecting shared relief. But as the crowd dispersed, the officer pulled James aside, whispering, We caught a gang contact in the hospital. He confessed the boss is still alive and won't stop. Ethan overheard, his heart tightening. He looked at Henry, his gaze steady. Whatever happens, I'll stand by you, he said. Henry nodded, gripping his hand tighter. And I'll protect you, Ethan. To the end. As they stepped out of the courthouse, warm morning sunlight bathed them, melting away the chill of recent days. Ethan looked up at the clear sky, a burden lifting from his shoulders. He was no longer the lonely street kid. He had Henry, and though challenges lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. The soft glow of late afternoon sunlight poured into Henry's modest home, filtering through white curtains and dancing across the polished wooden floor. After endless days in hospitals and courtrooms, Ethan finally stepped into a place he could call home. The house sat on the city's outskirts, its cream-colored walls and overgrown garden. A tangle of wild grass, bearing the marks of Henry's solitary years. Ethan stood in the living room, clutching an old backpack holding all he owned, a few tattered clothes and a stale bread crust from his street days. He looked around, feeling like he'd entered a foreign yet warm world. Henry sat in his wheelchair beside him, his eyes alight as he watched Ethan in a space he'd once thought would remain empty forever. Welcome home, Ethan, he said, his voice rough but brimming with joy. Ethan offered a shy smile, scratching his head. It still feels weird, he murmured. Home. Sounds strange. Henry chuckled softly, patting his shoulder. You'll get used to it. We've got a whole future to figure it out together. The first days passed in a blend of awkwardness and peace. Ethan enrolled in a nearby high school, stepping into class with new shoes James had bought him. Curious stares from classmates made him shrink, but he tried to fit in, though holding a pencil felt clumsier than gripping a shard of glass in that alley long ago. Henry, meanwhile, began recovering from surgery with a daily nurse's help. He spent most of his time with Ethan, sharing stories of Emily, Ethan's mother, her childhood love of drawing, her dreams of freedom. But not everything was serene. One afternoon, as Ethan sat in the living room sketching on paper Henry had given him, the doorbell rang. Henry frowned, gesturing for Ethan to answer. He cracked the door open to find Linda Harris from Social Services and a uniformed officer. "Hi, Miss Linda," Ethan said, his voice quivering. Linda smiled, but her eyes were grave. "Hello, Ethan. We need to speak with Henry. It's important." Ethan led them inside, his heart pounding. Henry straightened in his wheelchair, his tone calm yet wary. "What's going on, Miss Harris?" Linda sat, placing a file on the table. "We got a report from the police. A high-ranking gang member, the one they call the boss, escaped after the arrests. He left a message vowing revenge on you and Ethan for handing over the USB. The officer added, "We're stepping up protection, but you both need to stay vigilant." He knows this address. Ethan felt his blood turn cold. He looked at Henry, seeing his grandfather's face darken. "I thought it was over," he whispered, trembling. Henry took his hand, his voice steady. "Not yet, Ethan. But we're done running. We'll face it." Linda nodded. "Social Services agrees to let you stay with Henry, but we'll monitor closely during this time. If there's any sign of danger, we'll move you both to safety." After Linda and the officer left, Ethan sank to the floor, hugging his knees. "I'm scared," he murmured. Henry wheeled over, resting a hand on his shoulder. "He might come, but he won't win. We've survived so much already, haven't we? We're tougher than he thinks." Ethan nodded, though fear lingered like a shadow. That night, sleep eluded Ethan. He lay in the small bed Henry had prepared for him. Moonlight streaming through the window onto bare walls. He recalled Henry's words. "You can hang anything on these walls. This is your home." Rising, he grabbed a pencil and paper, sketching a simple image of two birds soaring in the sky, free and fearless. It was the future he dreamed of with Henry, despite the darkness still lurking. The next morning, he showed the drawing to Henry. His grandfather smiled, eyes sparkling. "It's beautiful, Ethan," he said, "like the pictures Emily used to draw. You've got talent." Ethan blushed, scratching his head. "I want to hang it up, to remind us we'll be okay, no matter what." Henry nodded, calling the nurse to help hammer a nail into the living room wall. As the sketch went up, warmth flooded Ethan's chest. For the first time, he truly felt what home meant. But that peaceful dream didn't last. A few evenings later, while Ethan washed dishes in the kitchen, a strange sound drifted from the backyard, slow, heavy footsteps on the grass. He shut off the faucet, listening, then raced to Henry in the living room. "Someone's out there," he whispered. Henry frowned, motioning for the phone. "Call the police," he said, his voice low but calm. Ethan dialed, heart racing, but before he could speak, the back door burst open. A tall figure stepped in, face shadowed under a cap, his icy glare unmistakable. "Found you at last, old man," he snarled, voice gravelly. "You too, kid. Give me the USB or I'll burn this place down." Ethan stepped in front of Henry, clutching a nearby chair. "It's gone," he shouted. "The police took it." The man sneered, pulling a knife from his belt. "Then you both die." He lunged, but Ethan didn't run. He swung the chair, striking the man's arm and sending the knife clattering to the floor. Henry yelled, "Ethan, run!" But Ethan shook his head, tackling the man's legs and bringing him down. Police sirens wailed in the distance, headlights flashing through the window. The man struggled up, aiming to flee, but officers stormed in, pinning him down. Ethan collapsed, panting, blood dripping from a small cut on his hand. Henry wheeled over, pulling him into a trembling embrace, tears streaming down his face. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice shaking. Ethan nodded, managing a weak smile. "I wouldn't let him hurt you." The police hauled the man away, the lead officer turning back. "That's the last of them. He confessed everything. You're safe now." That night, as calm settled, Ethan and Henry sat in the living room, the two-bird sketch glowing under the lamplight. "You saved me again," Henry said, voice thick. Ethan laughed, a real easy sound for once. "And you gave me a family. We're even." Henry hugged him, whispering, "No, Ethan, you gave me more than that." The next morning, Ethan stood before the drawing, adding a final touch. A rising sun behind the birds. He turned to Henry. "This is our new life, Grandpa. No more running." Henry nodded, his eyes shining like the dawn. "That's right, Ethan. From now on, we fly together." Sunlight bathed the small garden where Ethan and Henry planted their first flowers. A fresh start after stormy days. Ethan held a watering can, smiling at the petals swaying in the breeze, while Henry sat in his wheelchair, his gaze alight with a joy he'd never thought he'd reclaim. From two lost souls, a street boy and a man fleeing his past, they'd become family, bound by compassion, courage, and the scars of life. The two-bird drawing on the wall was no longer just a memory, but a promise of a free future, soaring high together. Thanks for joining Ethan and Henry on their journey. A warm, heartfelt voice chimed in. Did you cry when they found each other again? Hit that like button if this story touched your heart, subscribe for more moving tales, and drop a comment below. What moved you most? We'd love to hear your thoughts.